Good morning, everyone. I will just give it a few seconds to let people come on into the webinar. I should say thanks to Waterfront for organising the session this morning. You can see the numbers are ticking up. I guess I'll start by introducing myself as your chair for today's session. So my name's Estelle. I'm the Energy Policy Coordinator at Regen. For those who don't know Regen, we're an independent centre of expertise with a mission to accelerate the transition to a zero carbon energy system. We're also a membership organisation with 150 members who share our mission from developers, investors, local authorities, community energy groups, and we also run the Electricity Storage Network, which is the UK industry body for storage. Now, talk to any one of those members, and what you'll likely hear back is that the number one challenge that they're facing right now is getting a grid connection. So that means all those renewables, storage, heat pumps, EV chargers, electrolyzers that we need for net zero are stuck. And in particular, we're hearing from our members that projects seeking to connect to the distribution level are facing delays of, in some cases, up to a decade to connect to the network, largely due to capacity constraints at the transmission level, but also, underlying issues in how the connections process is managed. Part of this is also, of course, about how the energy system is changing to deliver net zero. So moving from a centralised system based on large-scale fossil fuel plants to a much more decentralised system with many more assets and actors than before. So making sure that we manage and invest in our network infrastructure to enable that is a really key topic, and it's a really key focus for us at Regen. One of our 5 strategic goals is to make sure that our energy infrastructure is net zero ready. And we also run a grid connections working group for our members, where we're looking at some of the challenges with the key players. So from that work, we know we've got a big challenge to get our connections and infrastructure processes right, particularly as we ramp up to those big energy strategy targets, which I think we're going to hear about shortly. And luckily there are kind of initiatives going on to help take on this challenge. So we're going to hear from 2 speakers today, each on their views on the current issues and the current kind of connections network infrastructure landscape before opening up to a Q&A session with the audience. So do put your questions in the Q&A function in the chat. We did initially have Susanna from the ESO joining us to talk about what's going on from the ESO's perspective, but I believe she can no longer join us today, unfortunately. But any questions that come that might be directed to the ESO, we can raise them with her. She's actually coming to Regen's next Grid Connections working group, so I can pose them to her directly. So I think without further ado, I'll pass over to the first speaker, which is Dan Borman, who is head of onshore electricity networks at BEIS. So Dan, if you're ready, I will hand over to you.
Thanks, Steph. And let me just share my screen. Apologies, everyone. I'm a Microsoft Teams person, so getting used to Zoom is sort of a new skill. But I hope that is now sharing. Estelle, can you see that? And can you hear me okay?
All good.
Okay, brilliant. Yes. So as Estelle mentioned, I'm Dan Borman. I'm head of onshore electricity networks at BEIS. So certainly this is an important question for me and my team. And there's many other teams that this is also a very important question for, as sort of Estelle mentioned, the renewable sectors, storage, and a lot of the other sectors trying to electrify. So I thought I'd take you through sort of latest government thinking on what we're doing on the electricity network, and then happy to take any questions on sort of thoughts or questions you have for me as well. So where to place this? I guess there's a lot of moving parts and things to consider when we talk about electricity networks and when we talk about decarbonisation as well. So one of the really big announcements and sort of strategy documents that government came out with was the British Energy Security Strategy in April. And that really outlined several measures that government were going to do to reduce our reliance on fossil fuels and also to accelerate network infrastructure to make sure that we could deliver on those commitments. So I think one of the big headline commitments within the strategy was an ambition to deliver 50 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. And we all know that to be able to deliver that successfully, it's not only about building the wind turbines, but it's about getting them connected to the grid so you can move that energies to people's homes and to businesses and to different areas. So government recognised that we needed to accelerate network infrastructure to be able to deliver that. And within the British Energy Security Strategy, we announced that we would be establishing a Networks Commissioner. So we were very pleased to appoint Nick Windsor as the Electricity Networks Commissioner as an expert in this field. And his role will really be over the next year to try and advise government on methods and ways that we can accelerate network infrastructure, particularly looking at the transmission network, given the amount of new network infrastructure that needs to be built over the next years. We're also working closely with Ofgem. So Ofgem are looking at expediting its regulatory approvals process to build networks. So that's an important part of this story. And there's sort of no one answer to accelerate network infrastructure. There are many parts that need to be aligned. So all stakeholders need to play their role within this. We're working with developers to understand the supply chain and increase visibility and certainty to procure things. We know that from the network companies that supply chains is an important part of this story, and being able to contract with them. There's a sort of not only a national increase in the need for sort of new cables, but there's a sort of global push as everyone tries to decarbonize at the same time. So we understand the importance of the supply chain plays within this. We've committed to consulting on community benefit options so that local communities can benefit from developments of onshore infrastructure. So this is an important part of taking communities with us in this transition, noting that there's going to be sort of significant new build requirements of infrastructure and making sure that those local communities can benefit from that. And we're also we're working with Ofgem to speed up connections at the distribution level as well. So that was the British Energy Security Strategy. So if we now move on to the Electricity Network Strategic Framework. So this was something that my team published in August, and it builds on the British Energy Security Strategy, and it also builds on a number of other strategies that government have published. So if we can remember back in October last year before COP, we had the Net Zero Strategy, and before that we had a number of other sectoral strategies. And why they're all important to the electricity network is because a lot of sectors are looking to electrify, and they're all looking to electrify at the same time. So they're all reliant on the network being able to deliver, to be able to ensure that they can connect and sort of deliver the decarbonisation within those sectors. So the Electricity Network Strategic Framework was the latest one in the bunch on those. And what does it do? It details the actions that government and Ofgem are taking to ensure a secure and resilient electricity network for net zero. It's important to say at this point that the Electricity Network Strategic Framework was a joint publication between BEIS and Ofgem, recognising that BEIS alone does not have the abilities to be able to sort of accelerate network infrastructure or deliver the network that is needed for the future. It sets out the scale of the challenge. So within the ENSF, I'm going to call it that for short, we published government analysis on the scale of investment required to develop the network. And that's a significant investment required, but it also creates opportunities for jobs and growth within the economy as well. So it's very much aligned with government ambitions. And what it does as well is it illustrates an ambitious vision for the future of the networks and the benefits that will deliver to the economy. So if we move on, I mentioned a bit around this before earlier, but the sort of context that we're in is that the UK needs to wean itself from expensive fossil fuels, both because of the war in Ukraine, but also because of net zero and national energy security. We need to evolve rapid changes in electricity demand and generation. So obviously, previously, if we look at the grid of the past, there was a lot of centralized generation in local areas, in big fossil fuel generation. Now we're looking at a much more decentralized model of generation of renewables across the country. And we're also looking at a lot more demand as sort of EV fast chargers, heat pumps, and industry look to electrify. There may be opportunities to or there will certainly be opportunities to create a more efficient grid in the future, utilising smart technology, data and storage. And there'll be a substantial increase in the number and variety of new connections to the network. It's worth pausing here and just saying that will also involve people that have never engaged with their distribution network or transmission network having to start that process of engaging to get a connection to the grid. So that will be a new process for many, and something that we need to help people to navigate successfully. So just a little bit more detail of what is in the electricity network strategic framework, in case you haven't read the 100-page of fun of it. We want to make sure that the electricity network are planned and managed strategically. So looking at implementing by the new future system operator, taking account of wider system developments. So you'll note that the ESO, Susanna from the ESO can't be here today, but the holistic network design was published earlier in the year, and that set out some strategic transmission projects that were going to be needed. And we're looking to develop that further into a centralized strategic network plan to make sure that we're building the network ahead of need and in a strategic manner. So overall, you need less network build is the goal. So we're preparing the electricity for net zero. So we want it to be resilient, anticipate, inspect ahead of expected need to be able to deliver an efficient system and meet government targets across the board. And as I say, this will be achieved through accelerating the transmission network and improving our climate resilience. So as I mentioned, Nick Windsor is doing a piece of work looking with the energy system catapult, I should say, looking at how we can accelerate the onshore transmission network. And there's a role for government, industry and Ofgem and the ESO combined to come up with solutions for that. And we all own a certain piece of the pie for delivering against that as well. Alfred, did you have a hand up? Was there an issue with the...
No, sorry, that wasn't deliberate. Carry on.
No worries at all. So one part that's certainly in government's ballpark is streamlining planning and consenting for network infrastructure. So how we're doing that. So we're looking at consulting on our national policy statements by the end of the year to set out sort of those guidelines which infrastructure can be developed into, and hopefully smoothing and easing the process for that. We're also looking at the land rights and consenting for the distribution network. So my team published a call for evidence alongside the ENSF on land rights and consenting. And we're looking at that on the distribution level as well as on the sort of nationally strategic infrastructure level as well. We're looking at supporting connections to the electricity network, so ensuring that they are affordable and timely for individuals. And obviously that's a lot of the focus of this conversation, and improving that customer experience. So I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end as well. And then some other things within the ENSF. So it was a wide-ranging document. So we talk about unlocking capacity in smart solutions and data. So looking at working with Ofgem so we can evolve and make sure that the grid is flexible and sort of utilising these new technologies that complement physical infrastructure, ensuring that costs reflect a changing system. So it would be remiss to not mention sort of the cost of living challenges that we're going through at the moment. And a key part of this journey on networks is also about keeping the costs to a minimum for the end consumers, because ultimately it is bill payers that end up paying for the electricity network. So making sure that they can sort of reflect that, and also that local communities, as I can say, can benefit from the network infrastructure that they are hosting. And then again, running through the theme of this and really important to government objectives is making sure that we're creating good high-skilled jobs throughout this, and making sure that the network supports jobs and supports investment within the country, and continue to enable cost-effective, timely connections. I think that repeats it. This might be a little bit sort of basic for people on the webinar, and they might understand this, but just to reinforce the sort of different roles within this. So obviously I'm speaking from a BEIS perspective and a government perspective. So we set the overall policy and legislative framework. So we, as I say, we announced the British Energy Security Strategy. We have our laws on net zero, and we've set the legislative framework for Ofgem to operate within. Ofgem are a key player within this, and they set and enforce the regulatory framework and support government objectives. They approve the funding decisions while making sure that they're protecting the end users, consumers, and network companies, as I've mentioned, play a really important role on this, and hopefully we'll hear from one of them later on planning and building and operating the network. So they will be the front end and the face that many people will see when they're talking to the sort of grid. And obviously ESO couldn't join us today, but they're an important role in sort of the electricity system operator for Great Britain as well. So as I mentioned, there's sort of many DNOs and distribution network operators and a few transmission operators, and they're the front end of what people see when they engage with the electricity networks. It's important that people get timely and affordable connections and facilitate the rapid uptake of renewable technologies. Most connections in general are to do the local distribution network owned by the DNO. Larger connections tend to connect to the transmission network owned by the TOs. But it's worth saying that, as Estelle mentioned earlier, they do interact, and certainly some of the big connection delays that people are seeing are because transmission networks need upgrading or new ones need to be built to provide more capacity in that area. So they're related, and this is why government's ambitions to accelerate transmission infrastructure is so important to the local connections as well. Activities and performance of the network operators are regulated by Ofgem. So as a rule, government don't tend to get too involved in individual cases of connection issues, but we will talk to Ofgem and talk to the network companies about how they're going. So what improvements are being made? I thought I'd just end on this because again, it's sort of part of the webinar, is that connection timescales, costs and inconsistencies between network companies have all been listed as barriers to connections. So I've mentioned timescales and costs a bit. Inconsistencies is just a point that there's different distribution operators and transmission operators across the country, and where you have different companies, you will often have some different experiences throughout those. So companies that might be working in multiple areas might have different experiences throughout the area. So that's an area that BEIS and Ofgem and industry are looking at as well to ensure consistency. So what we're trying to do, we're trying to improve affordability of connections, so people can connect to the grid, reduce the timescales, and improve the customer experience. And then just 4 quick things before I lose my voice. Increased digitalization, so looking at application automation and capacity heat maps, so people know where there's capacity to connect to the grid. We've obviously, or Ofgem have got the price control process that they're currently going through, which they should have final determinations by the end of the year. So this is setting up the amount of money that the distribution network can spend in baseline expenditure over the next 5-year period. And that will also look at sort of strategic network investment, improved monitoring and stronger incentives for distribution network operators to deliver on timely service to customers. We're looking at accelerating connections. So the ESO aren't here again, but they're looking at sort of options around queue management and sort of an amnesty to remove projects outside of the queue that are no longer going forward. We're looking at the industry, the Energy Network Association created a task force to look at improving consistency and accelerating connections as well. And Ofgem are also reviewing it. Finally, and I am losing my voice now, is that Ofgem are bringing through changes from April 2023 to the cost that people pay to connect to the grid for sort of what's it called, reinforcement costs, and BEIS is bringing through some legislation to support that change as well. So that should make it cheaper and easier for people to connect to the grid. I think that's all I wanted to share. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dan. That's a really comprehensive overview of everything that's going on in the connections world at the moment. I think there is a lot happening. I just quick apology to the audience. We don't yet have the second speaker who is supposed to be joining us from SSEN. He may join, but it's looking like unlikely given that we're 20 minutes in. So apologies to the audience for that. But it does mean that you get some one-on-one time with the voice of government. So maybe it's a good thing. I think there's some questions in the Q&A already, but I'm going to take Chair's prerogative and ask the first one, because what strikes me from your presentation, Dan, is the kind of breadth of policy and regulatory change that is needed to address this issue, and also the level of engagement that we need from not only BEIS, but from Ofgem, the ESO, from the networks, and from industry as well. So my first question is kind of high level, that given that this issue is kind of on the critical path to not only net zero, but also energy security, bringing down the bills by getting these cheaper clean energy projects on the grid. Are we moving fast enough? And also, given kind of there are so many moving parts, how are these all being kind of formally coordinated to make sure that we don't kind of drop the ball or kind of lose sight of what the key problem is here?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think if you'd asked some people in my team that have been around a long time on networks, certainly it hasn't always been the most glitzy area for government or the sort of exciting stuff. An EV, a nice new Tesla sounds funner maybe to some people than the electricity network. Obviously not to me. So. Historically, probably there's sort of been not quite as much attention, and maybe not needed as much attention because we weren't transitioning at the pace we are now. But certainly, it is a big step up for us, and we're sort of recognizing that step up. So within BEIS, we've been resourcing heavily on energy recently, and certainly the network's been part of that resourcing. So we've established new teams on sort of to accelerate transmission network infrastructure within BEIS, and it sort of seems like Number 10 and government and many other people that are interested are sort of coming back and asking lots of questions about the network and making sure that it's together. So I think the reason I say that is just that it sort of has got the attention of a lot of people, and I think that's going to be needed to deliver the types of change that we need to. Delivering the electricity network strategic framework was a really big deal. I don't think we've done a network strategy in a long time. I think we were probably called DEC when BEIS did that before, and sort of I think it's a big step forward, and working with Ofgem as well. So we've really got that commitment from Ofgem. Then they're not here today, but I think their execs get it, and their seniors get it, that this is a really big change, and we all need to move together on it. And I think the other big thing that government is doing is Nick Windsor's role as the commissioner, so bringing in that person with the expertise on the network to look across the piece. So he's not only going to look at what government can do in its lens, but also what can industry do, and what can sort of Ofgem do to make this work quicker. So I think we're all getting it, and we're all moving fast, but it is a big challenge. So I won't say it's going to be easy. But the strategic framework helps set that narrative, I think, and set the framework, and certainly we're going to need to sort of look across the piece and deliver on individual parts. It's always easier in policy sometimes when you've got one solution that answers the policy problem. So you can say, okay, do a phase out date on electric, on petrol cars, and that's going to be your answer. This isn't that type of policy problem. It's a much more wide-ranging policy problem. I shouldn't oversimplify the EV transition, but yes. So there's a lot of moving parts. So we're all keeping our eye on that. And yeah, Nick Windsor's role as the commissioner is really important.
Cool. Yeah, thank you, Dan. That's I think the framework, when it came out, we were really pleased to see it, and how comprehensive it is. I think I remember counting something like 38 individual actions being pursued by Ofgem and BEIS. So yeah, it's really great that we do have that to work off. You've already mentioned this a few times, but I think one of the key issues here is that investment in network capacity has kind of fallen behind the rate of deployment that's needed to drive net zero, and the delays in this kind of investment, especially on the transmission network, is causing constraint levels and also the very large queue of projects that are waiting to connect. I wondered whether, I know it's kind of potentially unfair because you're the only one here, Ofgem isn't here, it's kind of maybe their area, but I wondered whether you could maybe talk about the way that investment in that network infrastructure is kind of regulated and managed, and why that needs to change to maybe become more anticipatory, so we're kind of facilitating kind of decarbonisation ambitions of 2030 and also looking ahead to 2040, 2050.
Yeah, and certainly take whatever I say with a heavy dose of Ofgem. Need to sort of align and agree, and sort of it's their view that matters on a lot of this stuff. So we've obviously got the final determinations that are looking to come out for the distribution network at the sort of by the end of the year, and they will look to have elements of anticipatory investment within them. So they will look to provide funding ahead of need in certain areas. And sort of allow for those sort of where connections will come. I think the balance is always hard here, right? Because you don't want stranded assets, and you don't want to sort of build network that ends up not being needed in that location. So that there is a sort of the energy trilemma, and making sure that you balance the cost for consumers versus the sort of requirement for net zero and energy security as well. So that plays into it, but yes, you're right. Thinking about network investment, Ofgem have sort of created a number of ways to reopen sort of financial limitations for companies, and that will be a big part of the price control is sort of looking at those reopeners to be able to build new network as we better understand the need, because as we transition, there's a lot of unknowns as well, and unknown demand. So sort of being able to be more reactive is an important part of Ofgem's story. I think they've also consulted recently, or are consulting on the future of the RIIO processes, the price control processes as well. So that's another thing that they're looking at. Is RIIO the right mechanism going forward, and is that's something that we should be doing? I won't comment on that because it is is for Ofgem to really consider. But what I will say is you're exactly right that large amounts of network needs to be built, and certainly on the transmission level and on the distribution level probably more so. But the HND was a really good step forward in identifying network that needs to be built, and through the regulatory approvals consultation, government Ofgem are looking at how they expedite that process for industry. So if you just take what's in the HND alone, that's a large amount of transmission infrastructure. I think National Grid were quoted in the news on sort of saying sort of 4 times or something what we've built over the last 20 or so years over the next 8 or 9 years. So it's going to be a significant move. But yeah, I think Ofgem obviously regulate the funding element, but we need to look in the round at are we also giving businesses the right assurances that they can engage with their supply chains and deliver at the pace that they need to?
Yeah, thank you. There's a question in the chat that I'm going to come to in a second, but just quickly, because you mentioned the holistic network design, I wondered whether you could just talk a bit about how that kind of process is going to lead into this bigger, as I understand it, it's kind of a transition to this centralized strategic network planning process, and how that builds on kind of things that exist already, things like the future energy scenarios, and how that kind of all fits together.
Yeah, it's a good question, and I'll be completely transparent. It's not my team that leads on all of this, so I can give it a go, but I'm probably not an expert on it, because the HND, or a lot of it, has sat in the offshore. We have an offshore networks team as well, just for people's awareness. But yeah, so obviously the holistic network design was published in July. We're looking at a follow-up exercise in Q1 2023. And the idea is that slowly sort of more and more things come in scope. So at the moment it's looking at the offshore wind and making sure that can connect to the grid. But as we look to transition to a centralized strategic network plan, I think it's due the second transitional centralized strategic network plan, if I get this right, is due in late 2023. And then we're hopefully expecting that the future centralized strategic network plan, which unlike their holistic network design, is sort of looking at the network as a whole and looking beyond offshore wind and looking at how can we build strategically and what are the strategic network projects that need to be delivered. So that will ideally be delivered by the future system operator once that's established, which is expected around 2024. So that's part of the journey as well. So the energy system operator is transitioning into the future system operator, and they will have new responsibilities around setting this strategic network plan across the whole of the network.
Yeah, no, the proposals for the future system operator, I think, are really exciting. I think it's kind of a key missing link that we need in our energy system, someone that's kind of overlooking the whole system. So I'm intrigued to see when that develops, because I know it's kind of held up at the moment, and I'm sure you probably aren't able to comment on whether that's moving. So maybe I won't put you on the spot there. So the question in the chat is around community benefits, which you mentioned, and Emma asks, what benefits do you envisage being delivered, and is there a risk that these benefits kind of delay schemes because of engaging extensively with the community on what the benefits are? And yeah, communities do not like what is on offer and expect the negotiations.
Yeah, it's a good question. So I guess the first point to make is that network companies obviously at the moment do extensive community engagement already, and community benefits do already exist in some areas. So there's some community benefits that are already happening, but they're not sort of prescribed, and they're not there's not any sort of commonality between whether you should give community benefits or what level and how they should be delivered, and what we even mean by a community benefit, right? Is it money for that person? Is it a swimming pool for the area? Is it, you know, what is it? So you know, we're looking at through a consultation on setting out some options for sort of what government think could be some options around a more common approach to community benefits and setting that more standardization. So different areas don't feel like they're being treated in different ways. I think ideally it wouldn't, like it certainly shouldn't add time onto the process. As I say, there's already quite extensive conversations and engagement with local communities, with development within their area. So it should feed into those processes, and it should allow government and sort of industry to recognise the sort of value of hosting that network infrastructure in the area. And it should ideally bring some of the more acceptability within that area as well on the infrastructure, so that if I host this infrastructure, then my community will also benefit from that in some way. So we're very much seeing that as part of the journey of acceleration, really, around how can you deliver things quicker and take people with you on that journey as we increase the energy infrastructure in areas. So yeah, that would be the hope.
No, really important as well. I think Regen's been long engaging with community energy groups as kind of the important stakeholder that we need to bring along. And we've actually got a paper coming out shortly, which is looking at how we can make sure communities reap the benefits from offshore developments, which is perhaps more difficult because it's more difficult to identify kind of what the community is. But a really important area. I guess another important kind of local stakeholder is local authorities, and they could have quite a key role in kind of planning for energy infrastructure locally and making sure that the decarbonisation ambitions of local areas are incorporated into those kind of plans for network infrastructure. I wondered if you could speak to, because I know there's some work going on to think about how kind of local governance could be incorporated into network infrastructure planning. I wondered if you could speak to that. Dan is frozen for me. I'm not sure if it's the same for other people.
Yeah, I think his connection's just dropped. Hopefully it will come back shortly.
Fingers crossed. This is the problem when you only have one panelist to speak to. If there are any questions from the audience, please do continue to put them in the Q&A. Hopefully we'll get Dan back. So Peter says, is it possible to hear more about the upcoming report on offshore community benefits? Well, it's not my my area, but I can pull up the project page where you'll be able to find more about it and drop it in the chat. And I think we'll be hosting a launch webinar for it as well, which is something to look out for. So I've just dropped the link in the chat. Do take a look. And we also have some other insight that we've written about this, which I can also share with you.
Sorry about that.
That's okay. You're back.
Yeah, apologies. I did you hear any of what I was saying?
Just the start, but yeah, maybe if you pick up from the start on the question around local governance.
Yeah. Of course, and yeah, apologies everyone. I don't know. I think it's my internet, not my grid connection, thankfully. It's playing up. Yes, so local authorities already have a role within sort of being consulted on within the price control process. So there is an element of them feeding into sort of views on sort of network planning and network decisions. But it's also local area energy planning, which is sort of an area we're thinking about within BEIS and looking at as well. We know some of the sort of devolved authorities are sort of introducing local area energy planning. So I think that's something happening in Wales and certainly parts of Scotland as well. I think also sort of as part of some of the devolution details, there's interest from areas on local area energy planning as well. So it's something that we're looking at. I guess it's about understanding how that fits together with future thoughts on distribution system operators and how that fits together on sort of overall like planning, and whether the local authority have the information required to sort of help and sort of help with that planning process. So it's something that we're considering within BEIS. It obviously touches across many a team because as we think about decisions around electrification versus hydrogen on heating, for example, and a number of other areas, it's sort of something we're considering. But yes, the local authorities and local areas do certainly have a role to play within this, and there is a role existing, but it's whether what we can do is to strengthen that role and how we can fit it in without sort of adding an undue burden to local authorities, which we know are sort of stretched in many areas.
Thank you. We've spoken about engagement from communities and local authorities. I wondered whether you could talk about how industry kind of can engage in everything that's going on and what routes there are, formally or maybe informally, to kind of input into all these things that are going on.
Yeah, and do you know, is there a specific type of industry you're thinking of? Or?
Well, I guess particularly around the connections issue, and thinking on behalf of our members who are kind of developing projects and want to, kind of understand what the connections landscape is in the areas they're developing, and to input into the processes to improve that connections process.
Yeah, definitely. So it's a good question, and I ask because there's lots of different industrial considerations. You know, we've got obviously on the EV side, we've got a lot on Project Rapid about connecting new fast charging sort of infrastructure, and different industries will have different needs and different requirements of their connections, which is obviously part of this conversation, whether you're connecting to the distribution network or the transmission network. So how to engage, I guess there's a few ways. So whenever government does anything, really, we have a duty to consult, and we often run call for evidences before we do a consultation, because we often like to hear from people multiple times before we decide on something. So there is certainly opportunity. So we ran a call for evidence on land rights and consenting, and that's an important way to engage in this process and feedback views. I would also say that within my team and sort of more broadly, we hear a lot from stakeholders. So we talk to stakeholders, be that hydrogen production, be that, you know, lots of other different areas, EVs, all those areas, and we talk and we listen, and sort of those concerns get fed back either through government processes or through where the ENA are establishing a task force, and we can provide some feedback on what industry is telling us and what individuals are saying to us as well. And the other way obviously is through correspondence. So my team gets a fair amount of correspondence from businesses and individuals that are having issues connecting to the grid, and we sort of look at those and sort of see how they fit into the bigger picture as well. But yeah, I would suggest, you know, depending on who's hosting the consultation, be it Ofgem, be it the ESO, be it us, you know, there's a real opportunity to engage in those processes, and industry is an important voice around that table, and certainly sort of as we move to increased electrification, we need to be ready to listen to new voices in this field. So yeah, I hope people feel encouraged to participate in the consultations that we're having. As I say, on community benefits, we'd look to consult on that. That's one area. We've done a call for evidence on land rights and consenting. We're probably going to consult again on the national policy statement. So there's lots of areas for industry to engage with us and to hear their voices.
Perfect, thank you. And I guess also, you know, engaging through people like Regen, you know, membership organisations, trade bodies is a good way to be involved as well. And because I know we quite extensively engage with BEIS. I've got a couple of questions that I want to ask before I think we finish, because I appreciate you probably weren't expecting to be grilled for the whole hour plan. I wanted to go back to the question on flexibility and storage, because as I mentioned at the start, we run the electricity storage network, so it's quite a big topic for us. And I wondered whether you could speak about what kind of the government is doing to facilitate the role of storage in kind of addressing some of these constraint issues and kind of making sure that we're using storage effectively as a solution for constraints rather than kind of a problem.
Yeah, and it's a really good question, and I will again caveat that, you know, it goes beyond my team and sort of we have within my wider area, we have people that work on smart systems and people that work on flexibilities as well. So it's slightly beyond my remit, but certainly from my perspective and the bits that we're in my team. So constraint costs are a big question, right? And they're going to grow over the next 10 years. That's not revolutionary information. So we need to think about that, and we need to think about how do we build the grid, but also the smart solutions that will enable us to reduce those costs and deliver the lowest cost to consumers. One of the things that we're doing as part of the energy bill, which I won't go too much into the detail of, but was introducing onshore competition onto the electricity network. And that really opens up opportunities for delivering sort of smart and different solutions, instead of just big transmission cables in the future. So one of the options would be that if you were bidding in against a transmission operator and you were a battery, if you could help the grid and deliver the same services through either a mixture of cabling and smart or just through smart solutions, then that would be an option available, and that would be bid against the traditional sort of development of a big cable. So I think, you know, that's a really key part of the story of opening the door to different industries, be that hydrogen, be that batteries, be that different types of technology, to deliver network solutions. So that's one part of the story. I think also what Ofgem are doing on sort of reviewing sort of the connection costs will also encourage more investment on sort of smarter solutions, because reinforcements will be socialized to everybody. So that should create an opportunity for network companies to sort of build ahead of need and figure out that, again, instead of 4 small sort of solutions over here, we can build a battery or build something else that will service, you know, a few more customers. So I think it's a difficult nut to crack. I'm not completely in control of it in my area, but there's certainly parts of my team that will unlock the grid to be able to be more flexible and able to use those solutions.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think Ofgem is a key player here that could have the potential to unlock some of these issues. So it's a shame that they're not here to be represented. But thank you for answering as best as you could. So I think I will ask my final question, because I can't see any questions coming in from the audience. And I mentioned at the start that when speaking to members, this is kind of the key issue that they're kind of expressing frustrations to us about. And that it's kind of, especially around connections impacting their business, their ability to plan for the future. So Dan, I wanted to ask you, from this session, what is kind of one thing that I can take back to those members who were talking to me and getting really riled up, to reassure them that this is under control and that the problems they're having now won't be happening in 2, 3, 5 years time?
Yeah, I think the most reassuring thing I can say is that we get it. We really understand the issue happening at the moment, and we also understand the issue that's going to happen, over the coming months and sort of years, as well as sort of we try and electrify at pace. We're doing a lot of things, and I say beyond government. Government is doing what we can to really accelerate that infrastructure and help with the planning system and help with all of those elements. So we get it, we understand it, we're trying to push it through as quickly as we can. It is a real challenge. I'm not going to lie to you and say that it's going to be solved tomorrow, or you can suddenly build network infrastructure in a week. That's not possible. Network infrastructure takes time to build. We think it can take less time, but it still does take some time to build. So we're examining every option essentially to us. Ofgem are working on that, and I think industry really get it as well. That they're sort of realizing that these connection timelines are not great for people, and certainly even just part of the process side of it, of getting an initial connection offer that from the distribution network that is shorter, and then getting a longer one when you realize that you need a network reinforcement is not an ideal process or solution, and it leads to a lot of people feeling like they thought they would have an earlier connection as well. So we're looking at sort of how we can improve the situation on the sort of transmission network to remove barriers, looking at improving consistency, enhanced queue management. So there's no reason why people sitting in front of you in the queue that aren't planning on going ahead with their project should be delaying your connection. So there's elements of that. There's things around modeling of batteries and all sorts of different solutions around sort of freeing up space on the grid for connections. So we're looking at everything. We're open to hearing ideas from anyone really on how we can improve it, but it's going to be a bit of a journey. I'm not going to say everyone's going to be connected tomorrow, but we are all working towards improving that process.
Cool. Thank you. Yeah, I think big challenge ahead, but we're just at the start of kind of solving it and starting to get it right. So there's lots to be positive about. So thank you, Dan. I appreciate you stepping in and trying to fill the whole hour. As I said, Regen will be speaking to Susanna next week, actually, at our Grid Connections Working Group. So maybe if the audience has any questions to direct to the ESO, feed them through Waterfront, and maybe we can kind of try and find a way to raise them with Susanna. Cool. Well, thanks everyone for joining us and bearing with us with the last minute speaker dropouts. I think that is everything. So yeah, thank you for coming, and thank you to Waterfront for organising.